climbs off all by itself. It does it itself. Okay?
Yeah, you're right there with me though.
Every time I open the hangar door to go flying, I realize that I'm one of the lucky guys doing something that I dreamt of as a kid.
Frank, what was your combat flying, more advanced flying when you got into combat territory?
Well, I went through gunnery training at Nellis in Las Vegas, and I broke an eardrum while I was dive bombing there. So they grounded me and sent me to the Philippines on the boat, 21 days. I'll never forget that one. I don't know how the hell you ever stood that in the Navy, but I got to the Philippines, and I finally was able to get back on flying status, and I joined a fighter squadron there flying F-80s under a Tuskegee Airman, Major Charles McGee, who was one of the best leaders I've ever met.
He's been here a number of times.
I know he has. He's a great guy.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I probably owe my flying career to Major McGee because the doctor kept saying, "Oh, your ear doesn't look like it'll ever work to me. You only got one ply on your eardrum." Yeah, I know we can't do anything. So I finally went down to Major McGee and I said, "Please, sir, will you take me up from there?" So he said, "Let's go," right then. He took me up and we depressurized the 33 and everything, came back and landed, went back to the doctor, and he looked and said, "Oh, that ear hadn't changed." I said, "But I've just been flying." He said, "What do you mean? I told you not to." I said, "I know, but Major McGee let me." And so that's how I got back on flying status.
Well. In early 1940, a group of engineers at North American Aviation in Southern California sat at their drafting tables with pencils and slide rules in hand and started designing a new fighter aircraft. Just 120 days later, they test flew the prototype of their creation, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was fitted with a unique-sounding Rolls-Royce engine and became what is considered to be the best propeller-driven fighter of all time. It had it all: power and speed, range, altitude, and maneuverability, the qualities needed to escort bombers over Germany in World War II, protect them from the Luftwaffe, and return safely to their bases in England and Italy. The challenge and mission was to confront and destroy Nazi Germany. Thousands of pilots flew the Mustang, but many of them had a second mission. They were African American pilots and had to fight two wars at the same time, one against the enemy in Europe, the second to fight racism, segregation, and social injustice at home. Those African American air crews became known as the Red Tails. Blacks fighting for America was nothing new. Thousands fought on both sides in the American Revolution. More than 80,000 colored troops fought in the Civil War. 33,000 died. When the Civil War ended at Appomattox, there were few jobs available to freed blacks, so many enlisted in the U.S. Army and fought the Indians in the desert Southwest. 4 black units were created, 2 infantry and 2 cavalry, led by white officers. They served with great courage and distinction. 18 received the Medal of Honor. The Native Americans dubbed them Buffalo Soldiers because of their curly black hair and dark skin and their tenacity as fearsome fighters. They went on to fight under Teddy Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War. And when the United States joined the fight in World War I in 1917, more than 350,000 colored troops fought with America's allies in Europe, still in segregated units. One black infantry regiment became known as the Harlem Hellfighters. And 171 of those soldiers received the French Legion of Honor for distinguished meritorious service. 1 American soldier received the Medal of Honor. On February 19, 1919, after the war ended, the returning units marched up Fifth Avenue, and when they reached Harlem, the marching band broke into playing ragtime. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, there were already many African American officers and enlisted in the military, especially in the Army. But the Pentagon said that colored men were, quote, of inferior mentality, had smaller brains, and were unfit for combat, unquote. Therefore, were not fit to become pilots. Well, undaunted, hundreds, then thousands of young colored men enlisted and applied for pilot training. The government finally relented and created pilot and crew training for African Americans at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, near the Tuskegee Institute, which had been created by Booker T. Washington. By war's end, the program had produced nearly 1,000 fighter and bomber pilots and 14,000 navigators, bombardiers, and support staff. 4 squadrons of P-51 Mustangs became the most famous of those crews. And when they arrived at their base in Italy in 1944, they decided to paint the tails of their Mustangs red, so became known as the Red Tails. That group, the 332nd Fighter Group, served with great distinction, flying bomber cover and attacking Nazi targets in Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. They flew the longest escort mission of the war for the 15th Air Force in an attack on Berlin on March 3, 1945, 1,600 miles. In all, Red Tails flew a total of 1,578 missions, destroyed 112 enemy aircraft, and lost bombers on only 7 missions. Red Tail pilots earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 14 Bronze Stars, 744 Air Medals, and 8 Purple Hearts. 84 lost their lives. 2 Red Tail heroes join us today. George Hardy, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. His wings were pinned on in September 1944. He flew 21 combat missions in the Mustang over Europe. He went on to pilot 45 B-29 missions over Korea, and later became a KC-97 refueling squadron commander. In Vietnam, he flew 70 missions as aircraft commander of the AC-119 gunship. He retired in 1971. Hardy is a command pilot. His decorations include the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, the Air Medal with 11 oak leaf clusters, the Commendation Medal with an oak leaf cluster, and more. Charles McGee, Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. Eagle Scout, 9th in his high school class of 436. After 2 years at the University of Illinois, he enlisted. His wings were pinned on June 1943. He flew 139 combat missions in the Mustang over Europe, shot down a Focke Wulf 190. He flew 100 missions in the Mustang in Korea, and in Vietnam, 172 missions in the RF-4 Phantom. McGee is the only American pilot to have flown more than 100 missions in each conflict, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He holds the record, which will never be broken, of flying, of all pilots, the most combat missions in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, 409 missions. After his 30-year career commanding at all levels, he retired in 1973. His decorations include the Legion of Merit with oak leaf cluster, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 clusters, the Air Medal with 25 clusters, the Bronze Star, the French Legion of Honor, and many more. He is an inductee of the National Aviation Hall of Fame.
Afternoon, everybody. Please welcome Colonel McGee and Colonel Hardy. Charles? Yeah. Charles? Yeah, right. George?
Wow.
We deal with a Ford tri-motor occasionally. So, gentlemen, early 40s, Jim Crow, racism, injustice, and you're told that, as we heard in the film, about that you didn't have the courage to fly and all of that. Where did it come in your heads and your hearts to have the stuff to not only want to fly and serve your country, but also to fight racism at the same time?
Well, for me, it was involved, the country had come out of 10 years of depression. There was the war buildup. There were opportunities to serve. And even though we couldn't change racism, we're just as interested in the jobs available or enlisting and participating in what was taking place. So it was, I think, came to us rather natural that we should serve.
So, George?
Well, the thing is that although people made statements like that, we know in ourselves that this is our country. We're Americans. I loved history, and I felt I could do as much as anyone else to protect this country if needed.
How challenging was it, for instance, when you first got down to Tuskegee and realized that you'd have white officers? How challenging was it to actually do what you had to do to learn to fly, to earn your wings, when the attitudes about racism were there all the time?
Well, for me, we're glad to have classmates that were from the South and knew what was going on. They kept me out of trouble, if you will, and told where you go to buy gas, where you don't go, and all of those kinds of things. So it was a comradeship that developed that helped make the being in the South for the first time, I could say pleasant, but I wasn't involved in an area that would make it unpleasant.
George,
Well,
how do you describe the experience when you arrived?
Well, the thing is, you got down, you ran into the racism the minute you went into the South, because racism down there was by law. Segregation was it. And so when you got down there, I went to the town of Tuskegee once and never went back because that was strictly white. So I went to the campus or on the base. But the training was Tuskegee Institute with black instructors flying. That was great. But then in basic and advanced, you had white Army instructors. And I will say the instructors I had were great, the white instructors. They really helped me, and they did a good job, I thought.
Yeah.
Charles, what about your white instructors, Charles?
Well, as I say, I think they were there because they wanted to be, and they were glad to pass on flying information, if you will, for the Army Air Corps to us, since it was our first opportunity. And they were very willing. In fact, the first head of the Tuskegee Army Airfield wasn't very supportive. He didn't want a black airman at the gate with a gun if some white person from Tuskegee came out. He was followed by Noel Parrish, who couldn't change racism, but he was glad to be sure that our opportunity wasn't denied. And I guess at the end you can just say we accomplished the unexpected.
What the government called the Tuskegee Project an experiment. What did you call it, George?
Well, I didn't call it. Well, see, I had the advantage. I turned 17 in 1942. I graduated from high school that same month. But the thing is, before I got into the service, I read what was happening at Tuskegee. See, it wasn't reported in the white newspapers, but we had a number of black newspapers then, and they reported everything on Tuskegee, and we used to read that. So we knew that graduates started down there. It started in 41. The pilots came along in 42, graduated, and we read all of that. So by 43, when I got into the service, I knew that was there, and there's a possibility of doing that.
Yeah, that first squadron, 99th Pursuit Squadron, with all of their support, was an experiment. They were successful, but the Army never agreed that they were. But training had to continue, and 3 additional single-engine fighter squadrons came out of the training. And I can remember when I graduated, my instructor said, well, too bad they don't have a bomber program for you guys, because I think you'd make a good bomber pilot. I didn't ask him what he meant by that, but he apparently didn't know that just a little ahead of that, they had already approved medium bomber training, Mitchell B-25, that began a few months later. And so in the experience, we have 4 squadrons for the Mitchell B-25 with all of their support. But they're the ones that didn't get into combat, but we could talk later about the Double V program, and they had a great part in that, and we'd be glad to explain it.
Describe, every pilot who earns his wings has various experiences in pilot training. George, what was that whole process like for you, and how fulfilling was it?
What, pilot process? Well, it was very fulfilling for me. I went into service in 1943, the summer. I turned 18 in June and received orders to go in July, and actually started pilot training, aviation cadet, in December of 43, and graduated in 44, September.
Right.
But our class was down to about 30-some graduating in our classes. And after that, I trained in the P-40, and then about 60-some hours in the P-47 with white pilots who had flown it in combat, and they taught us combat training. That was in December 44, and then I drove an automobile for the first time. And then I ended up going overseas.
What was it like when your wings were pinned on?
Well, I was so proud, you know, to really receive that, that I went through that training and succeeded. And I was just so proud to receive those wings.
Charles, what was it like for you when you
Well,
pinned them on?
you know, sometimes folks ask me how I got into flying, and I said I was avoiding the draft. I'd learned to handle a rifle in ROTC at the University of Illinois and really heard about the flying opportunity because under the Army policy, they didn't get black pilots until they had black mechanics. And the mechanics were trained at Chanute Field, Rantoul, Illinois, which was 14 miles north of where I was in school. I think my ROTC instructor said, well, you ought to be a pilot. I went and took the exams and accepted, but I had to sit back for 8 months before I was called to go directly into training as a cadet. And then in training, I think I skipped upper pre-flight because of my college ROTC training. But after my first flight in PT-17 open cockpit was the first time I'd been around an aircraft, but I was hooked. To be able to go in the air and loop roll and spin and come back and put your feet on the ground, they had me.
Hey, George mentioned the different aircraft that you flew. Take us through that process, would you, the graduated process of different aircraft that you flew?
Well, I didn't fly as many aircraft as Charles did. But when I graduated, we'd flown the T-6 was the biggest airplane I'd flown. After graduation, then you transitioned into the P-40, and that was a regular fighter airplane. So you felt that was a real achievement then. Then we left Tuskegee and went to Waldoboro. And Waldoboro, we got combat training in a P-47 Thunderbolt. That was a big airplane. People called it sluggish, but once you got it up in the air and got altitude and speed, it was a tremendous airplane. And we used that for combat training.
Right. Charles, what were the different airplanes that you flew working up to the Mustang?
Well, the first aircraft I ever flew was the PT-17 open cockpit. This grill, I think my instructor, we were up over Moton Field, which is adjacent to Tuskegee City in Alabama, and I think my instructor said, you see the airfield they're building over there? I probably said yes, but I'm not sure what I was looking at. But our training took us from the PT-17 to BT-13 basic training, AT-6 Texan advanced training, each with a couple hundred more horsepower and more instruments, certainly. And then our first checkout, I was in the P-40, and that was quite an experience to go down the runway. We used to say you have to have a good left rudder to keep it straight going down the runway. But later, I became a member of the 302nd Squadron of the 332nd Fighter Group. The group followed the 99th. The 99th had combat even.
That was the pursuit squadron?
99th's the first squadron. 100, 301st, and 302nd made up the 332nd Fighter Group. 99th had been in North Africa, Sicily, and into Italy, and at the time they were moving into Italy, the 332nd Fighter Group arrived. And although Colonel Momeyer had recommended the 99th be patrolling Liberia, even though they're flying the P-40, they stayed in the P-40, but the group was combat ready in the P-40, and they said, well, you are going to do some patrol work. We switched to P-39 Bell Airacobra, but still left our training site December of '43 and ended up landing directly in Italy January '44.
And at which point did you move to the Mustang?
Okay, that part of that history is, say, 99th flying attached to white groups flying the P-40, interdiction and ground support. 332nd Fighter Group flying the P-39 was patrolling Naples Harbor and the waterways up to Anzio Beachhead. But in the spring of '44, they thought we had enough guns on our bombers to protect them as they were destroying Germany's war-making potential. Wasn't the case. Sometime half the squadron was being lost to the German Air Force and German gunners, and so they needed escort. They took 4 fighter groups from 12th Tactical Air Force, moved them to 15th Strategic Air Force. We moved from the Naples side of Italy over to the Adriatic side. The bombers are now flying, had come out of North Africa, are flying out of southern Italy. So that put us together. And of the 4 groups that were picked, 332nd Fighter Group being one of them, but some folks sometimes wonder why are we called the Red Tails now? Well, the gunners need to know that these aircraft showing up are not German. We're there friendly to protect, and the whole thing was to protect American lives, because if half a squadron lost, but 6 airplanes, 10 Americans' lives lost, and that's what we were there to save lives. And so, as I say, the color was to help those gunners know that we were safe. And
So was the decision made to paint all of them red tail, or were there other different colors?
well, there were of the 4 groups, one had a yellow tail, one had a red and white candy stripe, one had a checkerboard, orange and black, I believe it was, on their tail. 332nd Fighter Group, the red tails. So that's how that came about. Of course, you always get some more stories that they might have painted the rudder, and somebody came out and said, "That's not enough. Paint the whole tail."
Yeah, that was it. Originally, it was 15th Air Force red for all 15th Air Force airplanes, and the rudder was supposed to be painted the red, and but when we got them, we painted the whole tail section red. You can see it from farther away. But when you look at this airplane, that's painting right behind the red spinner. Each squadron had a different color. And I flew at the 99th. Ours was blue or checkered white and blue. And the trim tabs are blue also for the 99th. And each squadron had that around there, and the trim tabs were
That was
squadron
so
colors.
that was so our maintenance airmen would know what aircraft is landing. We had a pure steel plank strip on a farmer's field, and 2 squadrons at this end and one way, 2 at the other. But the mechanics need to know who is that landing, because we all had the red tail. That would help them, and they were prepared then to get us into the right spot.
How much pride did those maintenance guys take in your airplanes?
Oh my goodness! Right now, I'd say we didn't thank them enough for what they did, and some of them even said, "Hey, please bring my aircraft back."
That's right. The pilots had the name on the airplane, whatnot, but the crew chiefs knew it was their airplane, and that's it. And they just allowed us to fly it. So they had pride in it, and they did a good job. Yeah.
So most of your missions were what? Supporting the bombers?
Well, air superiority is the phase of aviation, I call it, and yes, to protect the bombers allow them to do the job in destroying Germany's war-making potential. Sometimes when the weather is bad and they're not flying, and particularly after we destroyed the Pulaski oil fields, they destroyed them, we had fighter sweeps, and we probably destroyed more German aircraft on the ground in fighter sweeps than we shot down in the air.
George?
Well,
What were your experiences? Yeah.
Well, the thing is, I got over there toward the end. I only flew in March and April 1945. I was still 19 when I arrived over there, see. So I flew 21 missions. And there weren't that many German airplanes around when I got. I only saw 262s, the jets. But the only time I fired my guns were on strafing missions. If a mission wasn't too long, the bombers are safe, you go back over Germany and look for targets of opportunity.
So most of your Mustang flights in combat were before you were 20 years old?
I was still 19 when I came back from overseas. I turned 20 before I came back.
What, you shot down, what, a Focke Wulf 190?
Focke Wulf over part of Beachy Aerodrome, Yugoslavia, and that was in August of 1944.
How'd that come about? What happened?
Well, our job was sticking with the bomber. We had great leadership in Ben Davis Jr. He let us raise second and first lieutenants know we're there to help save American lives. So we didn't leave the bombers just because German aircraft are in the air. If any of them tried to attack the bombers that we were escorting, we would dispatch an element to fight them off. And it happened over part of Beachy Aerodrome. My element was dispatched and got on his tail, and he made a wrong turn. So
His bad luck day, right?
Exactly. When you talk about age, I still remember that first experience. I'd been to Europe and came back in 45 and went into a bar with a friend. They asked for a drink. The bartender asked me for an ID. You know, I had my lieutenant's bars on and whatnot, but I was still 21 years old. So I said, I want a Coke. Give him a drink now.
When you were flying escort with the B-17s mostly, right? Mostly
B-17s and B-24s.
Both.
Yes.
When you were flying with them, how long before they knew that red tails meant that all of you pilots were black?
Some of them didn't know even throughout the war until reunions back here at home that the red tails were black. So if somebody said, well, I saw him go by and knew he was black, well, we had goggles on, oxygen mask, and flying, and you can say you're black or white or whatever color, whatever color
you know,
want.
sometimes you see these movies where the pilot has his
Talking.
mask hanging down. That didn't happen, see.
Yeah.
Your mic was in the mask. You had to hold the stick with one hand and the throttle with the other. If you had that mask down, you couldn't talk until you put it back on again, see. So you didn't undo it.
And not breathe, because your oxygen was provided.
Oh, the breathing thing. Oh, that.
Yeah, your oxygen was in there and your mic was in there.
Yeah.
See.
Yeah.
Yeah, a few of the airmen, in fact, there was some bad weather once, and some bombers had to land at our strip. And of that group, a couple didn't want to be at a black base, and I think got on a truck to leave. Others were glad to have a bed and food and stayed, so a few got to know that the red tails were black pilots, and it turns out even later on, as word goes, I don't know whether that's how much research has been done to prove it, but B.O. Davis finally put by request on his plane because it's understood that some groups said we would like the red tails, even though they didn't know we were black.
Wow. You mentioned Ben Davis.
Thank you.
Tell us about Benjamin Davis. Who was he and how significant was he?
Well, Ben Davis graduated from the Army school, but he had gone through 1936 is when he graduated, but he had gone through 4 years of silent treatment, lived alone, was only spoken to.
Was this West Point?
On official business at West Point. Now they've got a new dorm with his name on it. But he went through, so we had great respect for him. And when he graduated, he said, I'd like to fly. He was told there are no black units. So his service until he got his wings with the first class, he was aide to his father, who was the first black general for the Army.
My gosh. Who was Chappie James?
Well, I can say something about Tuskegee Institute had a very good civilian pilot training program. And when I went into training, Chappie was one of the instructors in their civilian pilot training program there at Tuskegee Institute. The Army wanted to make them active duty or warrant officers, and they didn't like that because they were in civilian status. But Chappie came on active duty, went through basic advanced training, and as you know, ended up being the first black four-star general for our Air Force.
How significant was that for all of you to see him pin on 4 stars?
Well, that was great, you know. You realize that we've reached the top now. But Chappie was a unique person.
All around.
He was a good pilot, and he had the ability to lead.
And we mentioned earlier that long Berlin flight, 1,600 miles. Tell us about that flight. Did you both fly that?
I didn't fly on that, no. And Charlie had gone home already.
I was over from January, November 44. That took place in 45.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting story for the fighter group on that. Once given that assignment, they had penetration escort, and because of the distance from where the Rematelli strip was in Italy, they needed the big fuel tank. We had, 75 gallons?
75 gallon.
75 gallon, but there was also 110 gallon. They were able to get those tanks and get them on in time for their takeoff, but in the penetration escort, the relief didn't show up. And so they were able to continue on all the way through. In fact, it ended up shooting down a couple of the jets that tried to prevent the raid. But a lot is owed to the crew chiefs on them finding enough big tanks and getting them all in time for them to make the takeoff.
Now, the 262 was much faster than the P-51, and they were attacked over Berlin. But our pilots shot down 3 of them, and they reported damage several of them. So we came out best on that. Yeah. They were faster than we were, but our planes were more maneuverable.
I think you'd have to understand, by that time, most of the senior German pilots had been lost, and so their tactics and effort with a new aircraft allowed conventional aircraft to take a toll on them.
Right. How were you received when you came home from combat, when you came back to the States?
Not very well in one way, but they allowed us a week of rest camp, and my assignment coming home in November, and of course a few days at home, but this is December of 44. The rest camp was a hotel on the East Coast, and the folks tell us that there was another airman there at the time I was, and we were the first blacks to ever sleep in a bed in that hotel.
Yeah.
But there wasn't in travel, you still had to check where you could get the food and where you might be able to bunk for the night for a long time.
So nothing had changed?
Things hadn't changed. It takes time for change to take place.
Well, I came back in August 1945, and I was assigned back to Tuskegee. Once you got back there, nothing had changed. Same as when you left. Off the base, segregation just as bad as it was before you went. So really no change in this.
Let's step forward to Korea. Charles, you flew what in Korea?
I flew
Charles, excuse me, yes.
To the P-51 again, but the D model. In Europe, I'd flown the B and C of the 51, like the planes, this is the C behind us. But met Chappie James again. I was assigned to the Philippines in base operations. War broke out. They grabbed 51 pilots wherever because our jets weren't in place. The 18th Fighter Group there in the Philippines had just switched over to the F-80, the first jet, the Shooting Star, and had given their 51s to the Philippine Air Force. But there were plenty of 51s on the ground in Japan that hadn't been destroyed or shipped back to the States. Chappie was ending a tour in Philippines, and I was just getting there. He was in the 12th Squadron that went up, and I was in the 67th. We left the Philippines, went up to Japan, picked up 51s, and my last flight in the war was, as I say, the November 44. August 1950, I'm going down the runway loaded in Japan, and we flew missions out of Japan while they built the first strip inside the Busan perimeter.
What were your missions? What were you doing?
Those early missions, we carried napalm, rockets, bombs, whatever. It was interdiction and ground support to push the North Koreans back north. And during that fight, I've actually flown out of Pyongyang Airport. We were within 40 miles of the Yalu River when the Chinese came in the war.
Wow. George, what did you fly in the Korea?
I got out of the service in 46 and went to NYU for 1 year. I wanted to be an engineer. But then I was recalled in June of 1948. But I will say one thing is that the Air Force was created as a new service in September 1947. Well, I agreed to go back into the service in January of 48. But in April of 48, the Air Force publicly announced, 7 months old, that they were going to do away with racial segregation in their assignments. It caught the Army and Navy by surprise and a lot of people. And President Truman then, 3 months later, signed the executive order.
You flew the B-29, didn't
Well,
you?
yeah, so, but what happened was, this is 48, I went back into the service, and I went to Lockburn. But I wanted to do something besides fly, so I applied for electronics, Armament Electronics Maintenance School, radar on aircraft. I really wanted to go into all-weather fighters. So I started that in September 1948. But the Air Force, they started integration in 49. President Truman signed the executive order in 48. And he asked the Army, Navy, and Air Force to submit their plans for racial integration. And they were received in the beginning of 1949 by DOD. And they approved Air Force and Navy in May of 49. They disapproved the Army. They had to resubmit theirs in 1950. But the Air Force was ready for integration. They received approval in May. By the end of June, the Air Force deactivated the Black Air Force at Lockburn. And within a matter of weeks, the hundreds of people received orders to Air Force bases all around the world.
And how did that affect you? Yeah.
Well, what affected me was I started school in September 48 at Keesler Electronics. I graduated in August of 49. I wanted to go to all-weather fighters, the electronics. Instead, they shipped me to a B-29 outfit on Guam, now a 4-engine bomber.
So how disappointed were you?
Well, I became
fighters to B-29.
I became a maintenance officer in the 28 Bomb Squadron. But as a pilot, I also checked out in the B-29. Right. And in 1950, I was put on as a co-pilot on a regular flight crew. And I ended up flying 45 missions over Korea, but not without incident. Although racial integration took place in 49, there were a lot of people in the service who didn't agree with it. And in May 1950, I got a new squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Fred W. Miller. He wouldn't speak to me, except in the line of duty. Well, we moved to Okinawa and started flying missions. Our crew flew our first mission on the 30th of June, 1950, up over Korea. In fact, it's a high-altitude bomber, but those first missions were flown under 10,000 feet. We had 500-pound bombs to knock out. The North Koreans were coming south through the mountains, and we would have bomb all bridges or anything in the mountains to keep them from coming south. But eventually it went up to high altitude. But on a 7th mission on the 12th of July, I was in a cockpit going through checklists for a mission, and I heard this voice say, "Hardy, get down out of the airplane." I wondered who talked to me like that. It was my squadron commander. He replaced me on that mission. That was the first B-29 shot down over Korea by Korean fighters. My crew was shot down, and I wasn't with them. But that's the way things were in those days.
Charles, you want to chime in on that?
Well, no, that's a story that of many things that happened. As I say, as we moved north, when the Chinese came in, we were already had almost conquered North Korea, but backed up. My insight on that is World War II, we declared war, we provided what it took to win the war. Korea, we fired a general because he wanted to win the war. But no, you cannot cross the Yalu River. That allowed the Chinese to come in. Still got a divided Korea. Vietnam and others somewhat similar. And I just tell folks, when you're using military power for political purposes, and talk about winnings, I'd say you can't, because politics is a compromise. So there's no win. And unfortunately, we're still faced with that. The tragedy to me is the hundreds of American lives getting lost, but we are preserving the freedoms that we enjoy here at home.
You became, you became a squadron commander, and you were at Clark Field, right, Manila?
Yes. When I finished my 100 missions in Korea, I had, as I say, got called up there right after getting overseas. They had stopped family travel. It had been reopened. I said, I want to go back to the Philippines and enjoy my overseas tour. But it was a great decision for my interest in aviation because I got my first jet flying in that F-80 there. The 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron had stayed in the Philippines, air defense, and coming back with my combat experience, and I had received a spot promotion to major while in Korea, and that was confirmed. I became commander of the 44th Fighter Bomber Squadron. So here I am flying a jet for the first time, and for 2 years, what a wonderful experience as we defended the Philippine Islands.
What was it like to go into a jet?
Oh my goodness, to me, that first jet, even with 100% power, you could hold it on the ground with the brakes. But to be able to go to 100%, let go, and be up at 20,000 feet in a couple minutes, wow. What a great experience that was. But we were still doing air defense work for the Philippine Islands.
How were you treated as a black squadron commander by all the white pilots?
Not a problem overseas for some reason. I ended up later other commands, but overseas, that type of experience, well, I'll put it this way. They closed Lockburn Air Base as 332nd Fighter Wing. B.O. Davis was the commander, as we say, late June, 1st of July in 44. I became commander of Richards Gabar Air Base in the 1840th Wing in June of 72. To me, that was the first, that level of assignment in the States from the closing of segregation and over those years. Fortunately, after that, it was like doors opening up. Many opportunities came, but that's why I said earlier, change comes about slowly. But I'm just happy all the way, and I'm lucky enough to have actively flown 27 of my 30 years. So lots of aircraft, lots of opportunities, and as I say, not a problem at all. Well, my first integrated assignment was Smoky Hill Air Base in Salina, Kansas. No problem on base, and I, like George, had gone to maintenance officer school, so part of my experience was also material and maintenance support as well as flying. Got along flying on base. My family, of course, at that time never got to Salina because nothing was available. Wow. But again, change took place. From there, I went out to Riverside, California. Again, there was no black housing around the base there at that time. And so you had to make do, and still, at the time when maintenance control first came into being, a bomb group and the first fighter group. Again, fortunately got along fine on the job.
There's a wonderful story that I doubt Colonel McGee talks about. You all have heard of Frank Borman, aviator, Air Force pilot, but also astronaut, Gemini and Apollo 8. Frank was in his command at Clark Field.
Yes, indeed.
Right?
Yeah.
And he apparently had a problem with a flight surgeon, as I understand it, and he was, getting clogged up and his ears were bothering him, and he was down. He wasn't able to fly for a while. And my understanding is that Frank was concerned that he was going to lose his flying career until he came to his squadron commander. And what did he say to you, Charles?
Well, we knew what his status was, and in talking to him, I said, I think we can do something about it. It happened he had been grounded because of it, whatever the element was, and the flight surgeon there in the Philippines didn't want to put him back on flying. And I talked to the flight surgeon. I said, if you'll monitor him, we'll take him up in the F-80, and you can check him out. We flew him, and he got checked out, and finally put him back on flying status. And as you say, look where he ended up.
Well, Frank Borman will tell anybody who asks that this man saved his entire flying career.
Thank you.
I might want to say I had somewhat a different career. Although I flew in World War II and Korea, after that I went to SAC and maintenance, but I was in maintenance. And SAC even expanded my maintenance career into armament systems.
Wow.
That's the guns, everything in it, so electronics, everything on the airplane.
So what was your Vietnam experience, George?
Well, I was a maintenance officer in the 19 Bomb Group.
Right.
And I flew B-29s. In fact, I saw every part of Korea, as far north as you can go, south around the Busan perimeter and whatnot. And I got 45 missions. But my last mission was the worst mission. The Chinese were coming in then. And we were trying to, I wasn't supposed to fly that day, but a good friend asked me if I could fly as his co-pilot. I said yes. Before takeoff, as the vehicle getting out the plane, I fell and caught myself. I didn't realize it, but I fractured a bone in my elbow. But I didn't realize it before takeoff. And we took off, and we flew an 11-hour mission. The mission was 3-ship formation to fly down the Yellow River to knock out the bridges to Manchuria. But we had to make sure none of our bombs went over the middle part of the bridge, because that was Chinese territory, see. So we flew down there to bomb the bridges, and I remember them firing at us anti-aircraft from China. But as I said to a fella, it's inaccurate. It was low, whatnot, so we came back. But by then, my arm was hurting like hell. Gee. And so after I got off, I got a shot of morphine out of my E&E kit. And I tell you, that was the greatest thing that I remember.
George, give me the drugs, right?
But everything was fine. 5 hours later, we got back to base. And the aircraft commander, I was a co-pilot, he said, stay there, they'll come get you. I said, no, I can get out. I started to get up, and suddenly, as if I was liquid, I fell down the seat. They got me out, and they found a bone was fractured in my elbow, so I didn't fly anymore after that. I came back. Wow. But coming back to the States, I got involved in more than just flying and maintenance, whatnot. And in fact, I was in SAC several times, but also went to an Institute of Technology for 2 years and got a BS in electrical engineering. And then I went to Japan for a wonderful tour. It was Japan that I flew jets for the first time. Wow. I had been flying recips. But in Japan in the late 50s, the dance craze, South American dances, hit Japan. The Japanese were going crazy over that, see. And there was a couple in our squadron. The supply officer, his wife was from the Philippines, and she was a good dancer. So my wife, the four of us used to dance a lot. And we ended up on some shows around there and thing. And one day, this fellow, Ed Dwight was a young Afro-American pilot. He had been selected for astronaut at one time. He was considered. But one day he said to me, George, can you and your wife give us some dance lessons? I'll check you out in the T-33. And that's what happened. So I got to fly the T-33 from then on in Japan. But then I made major over there and went to Plattsburgh, New York as a squadron commander, A&E squadron commander My wing commander was that same officer who wouldn't speak to me on Guam and Okinawa, Fred W. Miller.
He's following you around.
I served for him for 2.5 years. It was the best years for my career there. I loved
Did his
working.
attitude change at Plattsburgh?
Oh, his attitude changed, yes. I loved working for him the second time. Oh, he thought the world of me the second time. And I would have. I remember just after the Cuban crisis ended, I got a letter from the Institute of Technology at Wright-Patterson. They wanted me to go to graduate school, which I ended up going to graduate school. So I got a master's in systems engineering then, see. So I talk to kids a lot. Education to me is the key, see. And I got some good jobs after that, and a few years later made lieutenant colonel. So.
Yeah.
Well, we talk a lot about attitude. What's your attitude today about things? And of course, the key thing is, what are you doing about things? Are you saying something? Like, what is it for safety? They say, if you see it, say something. Well, we feel the same way. If you see something, what's your attitude about what's going on? Do something about changing it in the right direction.
Vietnam?
Yeah.
Vietnam, F-4 Phantoms.
F-4, great flying because it was tactical reconnaissance, no weapons, speed was our only defense, and we used it several times, so it was good, and particularly at nighttime, you knew, day, night, infrared, you name it, we had all of the opportunities, but at nighttime to put the throttle up and look back and see all the tracers way behind you. It was great.
When you came back to the States, you went to Maxwell? Was
Yes,
that Squadron Commander School or what?
But that was also one of my commands because I commanded the 16th Squadron for the year that I was there. But no, I ended up going to Europe and was air liaison for Houston 7th Army for a period and got promoted to full colonel and ended up in the 50th Attack Fighter Wing at Hahn Air Base in Germany. We were flying F-4Cs, Ds, and Es.
Right. Well, you mentioned education, and tell me about the Red Tail scholarship program.
Well, George, you want to handle that, Well, there are two scholarship programs really going on. The Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated has an annual scholarship fund, and over the years that has grown to where we give 40 $1,500 scholarships to a youngster leaving high school, going into college, and then the aviation space career study. The Red Tail folks also have a foundation, but they're touching thousands of youngsters across the country, flying this airplane at thumbs up, flying this airplane at air shows on display. But they also have an educational trailer, and for those that might have the opportunity, the trailer is up at Kid Venture right now. But they park the trailer, expand it, and show a movie. And then they give the youngsters a dog tag with things, like believe in you can, get prepared. Things promoting it, which is so important, what we like to do, model a youngster and help bringing them along, because they're our country's future.
Amen to that, right, yeah. George, you look back on your Air Force career. How significant has this whole experience been for you?
Well, it's been very significant because, remember, I went into service. I was a high school graduate, and I had a whole life ahead of me. It changed my life completely, say, aviation, flying, whatnot. But then I got a full education in the service. So I got a lot out of it. And I tell kids, you can get a lot out of being in the service,
Yeah. Well, that also helped me because I say I got called in the service with 2 years of college. through their program, I got a degree many years later because I kept telling the kids get an education. I said, hey, I better go finish mine if I'm going to keep talking. so I did. But the value lessons that sustained us are equally good for the young folks of today with what they're faced tomorrow. And some of that tomorrow we don't even know, so it's getting harder to mentor them, but we can't give up.
Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you both. Colonel McGee, Colonel Hardy. Great. No, you can stay for just a second.
I was going to stand up and say.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Stand. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
And to continue our program right now, Sam Bass, extraordinary aviator, 35,000 hours as a pilot. He also has earned the FAA's most prestigious honor and award for 60 years of accident-free flying. Sam Bass.
Thank you for the kind words, David.
And happy birthday, Sam.
Oh, yes, it's my 85th birthday today. We've got Doug Rosenhall here. He is one of the pilots on the Tuskegee Airmen, and he's with the CAF. And I'm going to ask Doug, tell us a little bit about P-51, just the P-51 general, and then we'll talk about this particular airplane.
Well, the P-51 is an iconic airplane, and if you asked 100 guys what airplane they'd most like to fly, 99 of them would say the P-51 Mustang. This is a C model. It's one of the rare models. The original Mustang was called the A, and it was a fastback airplane with an Allison engine. The Allison engine had a single-stage supercharger, and it just couldn't go to altitude and keep up with the bombers. And so we were selling them to the Brits, and the Brits had a great idea. They thought they'd put their Rolls-Royce Merlin in a Mustang. And the Merlin had the two-stage, two-speed supercharger, and it allowed it to go to the mid-30s or high 30s. It's actually certified to 41,000 feet. I can't imagine what it's like up there. But I believe you. And it really changed the airplane and made it the airplane that changed the tide of the war because, like the Tuskegee Airmen, went all the way to Berlin, and soon we had air superiority, and that was a big change in how things worked at the war. But the most important thing about this airplane, and is the stories you just heard from Charles and George, is that we use this airplane as a tool to tell a story. They talked a little bit about our traveling exhibit that's out at Kid Venture. We have an exhibit that travels all across the country. It's a 180-degree movie. The definition of learning is a change of behavior as a result of an experience. And so we wanted to create something that rose to the level of an experience for young people so that they could learn the lessons that these guys exemplify and carry those lessons forward in their lives. And so if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to try to get to Kid Venture or an air show all across the country that we get to and see the Rise Above experience. It's really powerful. And many of you know this airplane's had some problems in its life. We started with a restoration. The wings were sawed off, and we restored it the first time. And sadly, in 2004, there was a camshaft failure. The airplane crashed and was essentially totally destroyed. And our leader, Don Hines, whose vision was, really it was Don's who had the vision to use these stories to inspire young people and educate. And he was killed. I became the squadron leader. We raised a whole bunch of money and and took 5 years, got the airplane flying again. But we always look to the lessons of the Tuskegee Airmen. When you're trying to raise money to restore an airplane, it's a hard thing. But we always went back to the lessons of the Tuskegee Airmen, and that was what sustained us and allowed us to prevail. We got the airplane flying in 2009. We got the exhibit on the road in 2011, and this is our 8th season. We do about 40,000 people a year through the exhibit. And again, I've told George and Charles many times, sadly these guys are not going to be with us forever, but we will continue to tell their story and inspire young people for a long, long time.
Doug, tell us about what would be the typical armament they would have on this when they went on one of their missions.
Well, the C model Mustang, as you can see, only has 2 gun ports. It had some gun jamming problems because of the way the guns were mounted in the wings. There's a rumor out there that the C model has a different airfoil. That's not true. They moved the stringer stations in the wings so they could mount the guns vertically instead of on an angle. and that solved the jamming problem. And it also allowed him to put 3 guns on each side. So there are 6 guns in the subsequent D model. The B and the C are the same airplane. The Bs were built in Englewood, California, and the Cs were built in Dallas, but they're the very same airplane. But what they didn't do is they didn't increase the ammunition, the number of bullets. So when you pull the trigger on the gun in a D model, initially all 6 guns are firing, but the outboard guns share the same ammo bay, so they're going to run out of ammunition about halfway through the shooting process, and then the inboard gun, they have an entire gun ammo bay. So there are some differences. The gear system is quite a bit different. It operates almost identically from the cockpit perspective, but the way it functions internally is dramatically different. The wing strake right here from the leading edge, you can see it kind of juts out. On the D model, that's much bigger. The gear doors are very much different. You'll see a strake on the tail of all the D models. Some of the C models had a strake on the tail between the vertical stabilizer and the fuselage to increase directional stability. When they put the Malcolm Hood on the airplane, they found it got a little loose in the tail, so they put a little bit more vertical area in it. But the engine on the C model is this, and the Bs and Cs is the same as the D model. And in flight, it's a lighter and it's a cleaner airplane, about 2 inches of manifold pressure less to fly formation with the D model in the C, and that's a really big deal. So in flight, it's a glorious airplane to fly. On the ground at Oshkosh, it's really a bear because the canopy is very, very fragile, and so they did some overseas taxi with the canopy open, but they had more canopies. So we never taxi with the canopy open because we'll damage it, and they're made out of unobtainium. So there are just no parts. And so taxiing around here in the narrow taxiways and all the traffic, the scariest part of flying this airplane is taxiing at Oshkosh because it's really blind. So we're always happy when the marshalers show up with a scooter to clear the nose for us.
How many pilots do you have on the CAF to fly this?
There are 5 of us. Our objective was to have enough pilots that we fly almost every weekend, and we wanted to have enough pilots to fly the airplane on a regular basis. One of our pilots, Bill Shepard, is here in the crowd. Bill's a Canadian, grew up in Kansas, but lives in Canada now. Brad Lang is the son of a Tuskegee Airman, a Delta pilot, lives in California. Paul Stoikov lives in Cleveland, Ohio. Paul also flies the B-29. Shep flies the TBM Avenger and the trainers, of course. And Alan Miller just moved from Hawaii to Atlanta, Georgia. He's a Delta pilot as well, and he flies the B-25 and the Mustang and some other airplanes as well. So there are 5 of us. The idea is, you try to get in the airplane once a month to stay current. That's one of the issues with warbird flying. It's incredibly important that we maintain currency. And so limiting the number of people that fly, it forces us to commit to stay current in the airplane.
We're going to have some Q&A here. Does anybody have a question? Surely somebody's got a question. We'll make up something. Well, just a minute.
Thank you for joining us so much, gentlemen. At what point did you each decide to make the military your career?
Well, I knew they were bringing them in, so yeah.
Well, when I was recalled to active duty in 1948,
they won us over in the store.
Okay, but Colonel Davis had a shortage of pilots and Lockburn, and he put out a message to some officers to come back in, and that's when I decided to go back in and make it a career. But when I went back in, I wanted something other than just flying. I went into maintenance, and I made it a career after that. So I 28 years active in the service, and I loved every minute of it.
Anybody else? I've got a question that I get asked a lot, and that is, why is a farm kid from Iowa flying a red-tail Mustang?
We've got to go to a scene.
And You know, the answer is, if I had been a 8th grader or a 7th grader or a 6th grader, like the kids that we put through the Rise Above exhibit, and told my teacher that I wanted to fly most of the significant fighters and bombers of World War II, she would have said, you know what, you do good in math and science and you'll be a farmer just like your dad. But I had this dream to fly these airplanes. I was infected with the flying bug from a very young age, and I just never gave up. And again, if you go to the Red Tail exhibit, you'll see we give out dog tags to the kids. We sell them to adults, but we give them to kids. And that's a roadmap for life. And the Tuskegee Airmen story and all the stories of World War II, I think, are more important and more relevant today than they've ever been in our history. If you look at what we accomplished in World War II when the entire country was moving in one direction, we were all united against a common enemy and looking for a common goal. What we achieved was amazing. 1936, the state-of-the-art airliner was a Ford trimotor, and 10 years later we had the Boeing 377, a pressurized transcontinental airliner. That's a testament to what America can do with our productivity and our ingenuity, and the Tuskegee Airmen are a testament to what we can do when you want something bad enough and you're willing to work for it hard enough. And people ask me, how do you get to fly a Mustang? Well, I describe the air show business as hot tar, flat beer, and rare bratwurst. And I've been standing on a hot tar for 30 years flying old airplanes to get to fly a Mustang, and that's the lesson of the Tuskegee Airmen, never give up. And I'm honored to fly this airplane and carry that story to young people of all ages all across the country.
Doug, thank you. We really appreciate you bringing this icon for all of us to see. Keep up the good work. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for what you guys do here on Warburton Review.